And so in this time, in this era of apartheid realities that affect Indigenous communities and immigrant communities, and when we have so many similarities in our struggles, particularly this violence of displacement, of colonization, of racism, there's many things that we have in common. But what I want to talk a little bit about today, because I think we all know what some of our common struggles are and the ways in which we align ourselves very powerfully with each other, is I want to urge us to not to simplify that unity too much. And I want to urge us to think about what some of those differences are, to struggle with some of the questions that come up that we don't often talk about. And I don't purport to have any of those answers, but I want us to think about some of these questions. And for me, this is important because particularly as people who are racialized, people who are colonized, it is horrific for us to imagine ourselves in any way, shape, or form as complicit in the project of occupation of Turtle Island. But because of that reality, because we carry with us a legacy of colonization, and I'm speaking here to those of us who identify as having that legacy and that collective memory, I think it makes it even more important for us to not become complicit in the occupation, the banner just fell, in the occupation and the colonial project of Canada and the dispossession of our Indigenous sisters and brothers. And for me, as a migrant myself, someone who's first generation, or not first generation, I don't know how the generations work, but someone who's migrated myself, who still struggles with the Canadian state in order to have access to so-called Canadian citizenship, as a woman of color whose body bears all the markers that so many of us have of racism, of patriarchy, of colonization, of displacement. I come from a family of migrant workers who have been displaced for years, for decades. I still feel it's incredibly important to no longer have that simply as a frame of victimization, but to live with responsibility on Turtle Island. And so what does that look like? Colonization and settlement is as much a practice as it is an ideology. And so I think active opposition to it is part and parcel of any decolonization movement that we can hope to build. And again, what does that require of us? I think there's a few things that I think we have to struggle with. I think first and foremost is a rejection, particularly of immigrants and immigrants of color, of the model minority syndrome that's thrust upon us. And again, a lot of that idea around model minority is forced into us, within us, as an internalized within us because of the colonial system that we live in. The system that tells us that we must be grateful for our citizenship, that tells us that we must be worthy enough. And because we are worthy, we are here. And because we are worthy, we must live up to our worthiness. And so there are definitely reasons that many of us internalize that, and it's in different ways that we've internalized that. But I think one thing that it's resulted in is that as communities who seek our own histories as displaced people, I think we've abdicated our history of struggle collectively. And as communities who are grateful to being Canadian, what it might mean for each of us as individuals is why we may have limited gains in this capitalist belly of the beast. As a collective community, it means that we have largely abdicated our responsibility to be in solidarity with Indigenous sisters and brothers and poor racialized communities of color who are struggling, because we believe that if we have made these gains, then certainly they can too. And we buy into that dream, which unfortunately is something that we really have to be able to reject. And the cost of that collective model minority syndrome is our collective capitulation to the ideology of white supremacy and our collective capitulation to the ideology of capitalism and occupation on Turtle Island. I think a second thing that we kind of have to struggle with is transforming, particularly for those of us in the migrant justice movement, some of our terrains of struggle. And certainly No One Is Legal as a movement has its roots in the rejection of Canadian nationalism. It has in its roots a rejection of the idea of the Canadian state, because we know the violence of the Canadian state on a daily basis on so many different communities. But sometimes I think, you know, and I hold myself responsible as a member of this movement, is that our demands, even though they're out of necessity, have often reinforced the Canadian state and its legitimacy, both in terms of its impact and its ability to regulate citizenship upon migrant communities, and again reinforces the authority of the Canadian state to regulate the so-called Canadian society. And I think contrary to that, although it's harder, it's less tangible, it's not short-term, I think we need to be able to build long-term strategies and solidarities that are truly rooted in migrant justice, that's in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. And what that looks like, you know, I can only offer a few examples because I can't purport to know what it looks like, but I know in several situations, for example, in Vancouver, when different migrants, different refugees, different non-status people have been facing deportation, one of the first places that solidarity comes from, in not necessarily all situations, but many situations, is from Indigenous peoples of the land to defend people fighting deportation. And I know that that may seem something that's purely symbolic, not something that we can act on, because ultimately the state has the power to regulate a deportation, a detention, a stolen life. But it is something that we must build towards if we truly believe that the keepers of this land are the Indigenous peoples of this land. And I think within it resides a hugely transformative potential of revolutionary alliances that we all think about, we all dream about, that we're all building, but I think we have to build forward with so much more force. And a really concrete recent example of that, and Farah mentioned it a little bit, was the deportation of Lember Singh that some people may be familiar with in Vancouver. And what that saw was 1,500 to 2,000 people, predominantly from the South Asian communities, elders, working class people, youth, who stood at the Vancouver International Airport to stop the deportation of a paralyzed refugee claimant, and took direct action in order to make sure that we no longer abdicate our power to the state to regulate who has the ability to stay and who has the ability to move. And within that, I think, resides a huge potential for us to be taking more direct actions in order to make sure that deportations and migrant justice is achieved, not through lobbying, not through legal tactics, but through the power of the people to reclaim our lives. And as part of that process, to work towards the airport actions and all the subsequent actions to stop the deportation of Lember, were a series of delegations and solidarity that was offered by Indigenous communities in BC and in Vancouver to offer support to Lember and to offer very concretely that he has the right to stay on Turtle Island, and that is incredibly, incredibly meaningful. In Kahnawake, when I used to live in Montreal, there was an elder who had told me at that time, when there was a deportation of the Algerians, which some people might be familiar with at the time in 2002, who had told us at that time in Kahnawake that for No One Is a Legal movement to really take root on stolen land is for people to really understand that for us as Indigenous people, we cannot tell you that you cannot be here. The land is not something that anyone can possess. Try to hold the land and it will run right through your hands. No one can own the land, no one can own this territory, so no one can tell you that you don't have ownership on this land to be able to reside on it. So you can be here, but we ask that you live here with respect. We ask that you live here with respect for the original peoples of this land, and we ask you to carry yourself with that respect and to offer that solidarity to us. And so that's something that I think we have to carry with us every moment of the day that we are struggling in this movement for migrant justice.